and it's in the breaking we come unbound. And it's in the giving we are found. Yeah, you could barely change.
Welcome to A Medicinal Mind, Wisdom and Wellbeing, a podcast dedicated to the telling of authentic stories and the sharing of insightful wisdom, exploring science and spirituality, medicine and Mother Nature. No topic is off limits when it comes to growing our personal understanding and supporting our collective well-being. With your host, Dr. Rob Abbott, a family medicine resident practicing spiritually focused and evolutionarily informed functional medicine, we hope to nourish your being so that you can flourish in whatever the moment has called for you to do.
And I know you tried.
In episode 34 of A Medicinal Mind, Wisdom and Wellbeing, I remain in the non-medical world, exploring rural community wellness with pioneering activist and vice president of the Center for Rural Strategies, Tim Marema. Tim is an editor of the Daily Yonder, a news site published by the Center for Rural Strategies that covers rural economics, politics, and culture using professional journalists, community correspondents, scholars, and a wide range of policy advocates. In our conversation, Tim and I explore the life of the rural community, beginning with Tim's very own life story, growing up in a small rural community in Kentucky, asking and answering such questions as, from the perspective of a rural community, what is your definition of health, and how do we cultivate it? What are the biggest barriers to wellness within rural communities? And how, as clinicians and advocates, can we empower and support communities and protect their cultural and geographic heritage? Tim shares with us the work of the visionary nonprofit Rural Strategies, an organization seeking to improve economic and social conditions for communities in the countryside through this creative and innovative use of media and communications. We then close the conversation with an exploration of faith and Tim's personal story of spirituality, reflecting on the importance of spiritual institutions for creating social engagement, wellness, and a space for finding joy. I am so thankful for connecting with Tim and for all the members of Rural Strategies for their selfless work, advocating and promoting the health of rural communities. As many of you know, I am currently in my family medicine residency training in Front Royal, Virginia, a rural community in and of itself within the greater Shenandoah Valley area. And so, rural health and wellness is certainly something close to my heart. I really hope you enjoy the show. Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining me on a podcast today. I'm really excited to share a conversation with you to talk about some things that perhaps are a little bit different than the straightforward medical podcast I've been having. So wanted to get things started by letting you share a little bit about who you are and perhaps how we connected.
Sure. Thank you, Rob, for inviting me to have a conversation. I'm really happy to do this. And I mean that like it makes me feel good. So that's a good feeling to have. I work for the Center for Rural Strategies, which is a nonprofit organization that works in communication and organizing for rural advocacy groups and rural service groups in all sorts of different areas like education, health, broadband, transportation, etc. And we have several different projects. One is the publication I edit, the Daily Yonder, which is a rural news site. Another is how you connected with Rural Strategies is through the National Rural Assembly, which is a group, a network of groups around the country that work together and try to support each other to develop a rural voice in policy matters. And you heard Whitney Kimball Coe, my friend and colleague, on the podcast on Being with Krista Tippett, and then got in touch. So that's how we met, which was a nice way.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple things there about within sort of your mission and values, your organization, your nonprofit. To me, from the very beginning, after seeing this podcast and hearing Whitney, I was just blown away. I was like, I need to be in touch with these folks because there are so many overlapping values. And simply put, when I was looking at the main initiatives, the main values that you were wanting to push forward, you were talking about, the environment and natural resources. You were talking about education. You were talking about health, and every single one of these is something that's so important to me. And I try to make a big part of my life, whether it's in the trenches of medical work or sort of outside of the hospital setting. But I just saw those values and the work that you guys are trying to do, and said we need to have a conversation because I think there is a story and a layer here that can help empower people, even those outside of rural communities. So, would love for you to share maybe a little bit more about your personal story. How did you even come to create this organization, this kind of family and network of rural communities and organizations?
We started in 2001, so we're it always feels like we're brand new, but we've got some years on us now. I grew up in Eastern Kentucky, and the folks I help create rural strategies with are from that area as well. And we met through an arts organization called Apple Shop, APPALSHOP. And that's kind of the origin of the organization comes out of that. My background, I grew up in Jackson County, Kentucky, which is a small county kind of in the foothills. It's in the Knobs region of Kentucky. And it was, when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, it was tobacco and maybe a little beef cattle and some dairy. And my parents were school teachers at a Christian boarding school that was run by the denomination that my dad grew up in, which is the Reformed Church in America. So I grew up in this very interesting community of people who were from off, as they would say, but who were closely connected to things going on in the community, and definitely part of the the religious and church life of the community. And I went to the public school system where I got a big dose of local culture and local friends and experiences of what that area is really like. So it was during the 1960s, right? Yeah, my parents moved there when I was a little baby in 1962. So the war on poverty began in 65 or so, 66. And a lot of things started to happen in Appalachia, which this is part of. But it was a distressed area, but culturally and in human terms, very rich.
I love that last sentence there, perhaps in ways that popular society sees monetarily or, financially being poor, but culturally being very rich. And I see that every day in my work. I've chosen to go to a couple smaller rural communities in sort of central and North Virginia, in Winchester and Front Royal. And it's interesting seeing the contrast between some of the folks who come, in this area from West Virginia, from Pennsylvania, from Maryland, and hearing their stories. And on the same day, you can have people with drastically different environments and backgrounds. Some people are commuting to DC to be, and working this government job, while other people are coming from West Virginia and they're, farmers, or they're just tied with their local community. And it's been really enriching for me to see some of the depths of that deep kind of cultural community and connecting experience from some of these people in these rural environments. And I can't tell you how many times I've asked some of my patients, so where did you grow up? And they're like, well, grew up here and stayed here. And, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. People have a lot of pride in where they grew up and a lot of tie to that community, and they care about the community. I think one of the things I'd love to get your opinion on is something that I've been thinking about, but our millennial generation, we don't stay put in one place very long. So it's hard to get committed to a community. And as soon as something comes up that maybe you don't really agree with, or there seems like something better, or something in your community just seems off, it's easy to go and move and be somewhere else. But I was curious, from your standpoint, do you feel like that's something that's hurting rural communities, that are, generation, maybe popular society is saying, hey, go find something better. And in order to do that, you need to leave those home roots. You need to leave that, childhood upbringing.
We hear it expressed a couple different ways. One is, sadness that young people do move off. Another way that's very optimistic, I think, is that there's a kind of a movement of go and come back. And there's some evidence that this is a pattern for lower populated areas, small cities and rural areas, that young people go for a job or for college and start a career, and maybe they get married or do other things that are kind of normal life pattern experiences. And at the point that they are ready to have kids or have a couple kids, home, being the place they came from, becomes very attractive because of, the family connection, the ease at which, anything from traffic considerations to being able to get into preschool, or, there's less hassle, in my opinion, in a rural area. So there's some evidence that young people are doing that, going out and coming back, which is kind of the best of both worlds, because you get, you get young people with a lot of really good experience and a different way of looking at things from their time away, but yet they're back and ready to contribute to the community. I do think that one of the values of rural is, I wouldn't say staying put, but a commitment, whether expressed or just implied, that this is the place and these are the people. Here they are. This is the hand I've got. And so I always say, one example is, you can't get in a fight with your mechanic because you need your car fixed. Yeah. And and you can't just go down the street to the other mechanic. There's one or there's two. And there's so many things like that where we maintain some level of connection even when we disagree. And there's problems that come with that, but there's also just there's a value in working in maintaining a relationship even during times of disagreement.
Yeah, that's a wonderful kind of story, metaphor, whatever you want to call it. It's a really beautiful description, I think, of these rural communities. And I've spent a little bit of time with my grandfather, who is in the mountains of North Carolina, and you see that firsthand, like you said, like that's the mechanic. So when that your car breaks down, that's who you go to. And if you do something, or someone in your family does something to create a little abrasive disagreement, that can be a little rough to navigate, but you're going to have to navigate it. And I've probably spent the most time when speaking with my patients from some of these rural communities, really trying to figure out what is their vision and definition of health and how to remain healthy. I think, and once again, not to generalize, but I think on sort of a bigger scale, popular media has painted this picture of some of our rural communities, the Bible Belt, the Deep South, as these really unhealthy areas where there is so much obesity and everyone just eats fried foods. And it's really been frustrating to me to see that picture painted and see patients come in with a little bit of guilt, like that they did something wrong, or that or as clinicians, we're going to be prejudiced towards them because of where they come from and the way that they eat or what they see as important. So it's something I've really spent a lot of time with my patients trying to figure out, and wanted to get your thoughts on, well, personally, what you see as your definition of health, and how can we be better at cultivating relationships with folks from rural communities who might have a different view of health than we do in traditional medicine.
Well, personally, I look at health definitely in a, the glorified term is holistic way, but, mind, body, and spirit, that my emotional health, my physical health, my spiritual health, they are mutually supporting. And if one's not doing so great, the other parts likely are not going to be doing so great. I was also thinking about health in terms of smaller places where you were talking about some of the values that we work from in our organization of conservation and of the value of place and of local culture and those things. And I think that sometimes it's easier to see our connection to say a healthy environment in a rural place. It can be more direct. The impact could be more direct because we're out in a country area, and what happens there environmentally has a direct impact. And those values are kind of a piece, I would say, that they support each other as well. I care about the place, and that makes me care about conservation in a certain way. And I would say one disconnect between rural and urban often is around our environmental issues, that a value of rural in general is that we're stewards of the land, which is not just a lock it up in wilderness kind of connection, but how do you sustain it in a way that you can earn a living from it? So, and urban environmental organizations sometimes in rural areas come across as, they just want to keep me from hunting on that. They just want to keep me from being able to get firewood on that land. That kind of disconnect.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting you describe this concept of health, and for most people, what they're actually putting first for themselves is this idea of the health of the community, the health of the environment of their community, the health of other members of their family, their friends, and thinking of them first, but also sort of entangled within there is the health of themselves. And it's amazing hearing you say it, and kind of even thinking back to I think some of the Native American principles. It's a very similar concept, at least in my mind, of this stewardship. This there's no ownership. We're just stewards of this land and almost stewards of this body, of this life. And what can I do to help others in my family, in my community, to be the best stewards that they can be? And I don't know, these are just some thoughts I've had, and I love that word stewardship. It's interesting that you brought that up. I was curious if you wanted to elaborate a little bit more about how you see, what you see as a steward, or your idea of stewardship.
Well, I definitely come at the word stewardship through, kind of traditional Protestant Christian upbringing. Your tithe, that's part of your stewardship, is taking care of your, supporting your church. There's that part of it. You're giving something. But when you connect it to land, you're caring for it. You're a steward of the land. In fundraising, which is something that I am also involved with, stewardship is the part of the contribution process that's about paying attention to the donor and listening to what they have to say and giving them information and not asking for anything, but building the relationship. So there are all these different connotations with stewardship. And I would not say that, rural folks don't, like this is we all own this in common. That's not the case, except for the public lands, of course. But, and what we do affects each other. But, and I don't want to over romanticize it, because you may live next to somebody who's burning tires or dumping his motor oil in the ditch, or and like I did in eastern Kentucky, next about a half mile from a strip mine. There it's not bucolic, but there's a chance. And I think these same principles apply to cities and to human beings in general. They play out differently in rural areas because the scale is smaller. You're more likely to see a direct impact of things you do. More likely to deal with the same people over and over. There's more kind of community accountability for good and bad. I know where I grew up, there were countless women who had absolute permission to grab me by the ear, and straighten me up if I was misbehaving, which was a good thing for child raising. You might not like it when you're 40, though. So the interconnectedness of people is easier to feel for me in a small community than it is in a larger one. But wherever we go, I think, part of health is building that community of support and friendship and love and nurture around each other.
Oh, goodness. Yes, exactly. My heart is speaking those same words. I love that description. Like I said, not to necessarily romanticize it, because I've seen those places too, where you go by and you peek out the car window and you're like, wonder what's going on there. But it's I'm sitting here, and amidst that sort of positive imagery, and trying to avoid being too negative, I want to ask a very sort of kind of a abrupt question, and there's going to be many answers, but I think it's something that we have to talk about, and would love your thoughts. But what do you see as the biggest barriers to wellness and health within these rural communities? Or perhaps more specifically, why are people in rural communities suffering?
Well, a good question. And there is suffering, of course, as there is in urban areas as well. But as you alluded to earlier, in general, rural people, if you live in a rural area, your chances of having any number of chronic health conditions go up: type 2 diabetes, obesity, heart disease. It's all worse for rural people. And on the Daily Yonder, I occasionally do a story when they do the national health rankings. It's called the National Health Rankings and Roadmap, I believe. And they rank counties within states. And I won't bore you with the methodological details that I used, but in general, the farther out you were in terms of being more rural, the the lower you ranked.
Mm,
And it looked at things like access to health facilities and education levels, not just at, this was community health, not individual health.
gotcha.
Um, yeah, public health, I guess you'd call it. But interestingly, the the core cities were less healthy than the immediate surrounding areas around the core cities, and then from that point on, it got less. You got ranked lower as you went toward rural, and so there was this
Mm,
commonality between kind of core cities, inner cities, and rural. Um, the common denominator that I see is poverty,
yeah.
and um, and the people I have talked to say, explain why that graph looks the way it does. Poverty affects our health in countless ways. It makes it much more difficult to get the help you need. It makes everything more difficult. And treatment, education levels, just on and on. So there is in parts of rural America long-lasting, entrenched poverty, and I think that has everything to do with uh, illness and poor health, um, and that's something that we have in common with urban areas where there's lots of poverty. You're going to see those communities not be healthy.
Yeah. It's almost if, I was kind of picturing like a donut. Like you said, sort of there's this little maybe donut band of slightly more healthy communities around the inner city. But then as you get outside of there, you reach, like you said, more rural areas, and maybe access to healthcare and poverty is more entrenched, and it can be a bigger challenge to remain well. I find it, so we, even if we recognize that and we see that poverty, it can be challenging to kind of organize and create an initiative to go and help people in these communities. Because I'll tell you, the first thing that that scares me when I think about wanting to go in these places is coming across as being preachy, or even patronizing, or trying to tell people, well, this is what you should do to be healthy, before asking, what do you think you need in order to remain well? And so certainly can be intimidating to want to go go out into the community and seem like you're saying, oh, you're doing all these things wrong, and do these things instead. So perhaps we can get real practical from your standpoint. What would be the things that would best support these communities to get out of poverty, to start to address some of these deep-seated chronic health conditions that are also sort of breaking the bank of our government nationally?
I spoke with a kind of a public health organizer who was associated with the study that I mentioned, and he was working specifically in rural areas, and we kind of went through the litany of difficulties and low scores and bottom of the barrel rankings. And I said, tell me the good things. What
Yeah.
is it? Is it different working there? And so the asset was the people, and that he said, well, there's a better chance if you're working on a public health issue, if you need to get the superintendent of schools involved, there's a good chance that somebody on the committee babysat for him,
Yeah.
or goes to church with him, or the fire chief, that organizing was easier because there were interpersonal connections, not just in a city. You would make my organization would call your organization, and we would start from a professional point of view. So one asset of rural places that I think gets overlooked is that knowing each other is an asset, and interrelationships, and how to help is that. My parents had one way. They were school teachers, and they kind of intervened in some specific instances where people had special needs, and they felt compelled to, become more deeply involved with some of the students because of special conditions, and then others they didn't. And the then there are the kind of the youth group experiences, which I've seen a lot of in Eastern Kentucky, where you go and you do housing rehab or work on a new house construction in an area that's economically distressed. And I think in general, the people doing the work are the ones who get the real benefit because they get that experience. Our approach is that local people know best what they need, and that there is leadership at the local level, and that finding, the inclusive places, the folks who are including people from across the community in programs and decision making, not just paternalistic or saying we're going to serve this set of folks and not deal with these others. And to have that kind of relationship with a place, you have to have a guide. You can't walk into a community and say, here's the person I should work with. So a lot of what we do is work with community-based organizations, and they're the experts.
Yeah.
And that has been a real successful model because you get an entree to the community that you can't get just walking in, and you understand things about it that you would not otherwise understand. So part of it is picking the right organization to be involved with. And then I would say from a national and, from a policy standpoint, there's a lot we can do as people who care about people in places that, some policies help more than others, and becoming educated and working on that is one way to help those places that are struggling as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I completely agree with this idea of it's almost, in essence, sort of decentralization, but going to the communities and saying, hey, guys, what do you need? I'll try to give you some of the raw materials and resources and network out when needed. But what do you guys really need? Let's give you the resources to try to help your community because you know best. It's, I envision a lot of other alternatives of, models for health insurance, or people talk about a single payer system. But I see, ideally, I think the best networks and best form of delivering healthcare is going to have little pockets of that are really tied to that community. Because guess what? The people in Northern California, their needs are going to be radically different than the people in Mississippi. So why would I want the same health insurance company or same people sort of running that system? And so let's go to the communities. Let's empower them, give them some resources so they can help themselves because they know their needs. And it'll be I think, it's a long journey, but organizations like yourself are certainly trying to make that more possible and bring bridges to within those communities and outside. So in the end, people can can extend their boundaries to maybe go find a different experience and then bring it back, or go find some new resources and bring it back. And I don't know, to me it's more hopeful than than, pessimistic. So I'm glad that you are doing the work that you're doing, and are connecting all these communities that are very like-minded. I wanted to maybe shift gears a little bit for the end of our conversation. You've been talking quite a bit so far. You've woven in elements of your faith and your upbringing into this conversation. But wanted to just really get our feet wet and dig into the sand here with this idea of faith and spirituality, and really, first, what does faith mean to you, and two, what does faith at the community level look like?
Yeah, well, let me start at the community level. And it's not necessarily faith. This is more of a kind of a social institution. Churches are so important. They are glue, and in places where there are not a lot of, there's not a Lions Club, there's not a medical clinic, there's not formal structures to address issues. There are churches where people, naturally work together to solve, identify and solve problems. And I love that. That a faith community is also the community that helps take care of the physical needs of a place too. That's a beautiful idea.
Yeah.
And when it works well, it's extraordinary. For me, on an individual level, so I was raised, pretty straight up Calvinist. The denomination my parents worked for was the Reformed Church in America, which is, historically that's the Dutch Reformed, and we had Sabbath rules when I was a kid, not riding my bike on Sunday or playing basketball. It was pretty conservative, and I would say strict. I say there were some of these Dutch dorm mothers who put the D in dour. They knew they could. They were. It was a strict environment. That's one thing I think of, and so that has been, that's been a challenge for me to kind of come to my own terms about what's appropriate behavior. I have come, far from that, but in other ways am firmly kind of in this idea that that there is something in a religious sense that being united around people is good and important. So I'm a Unitarian Universalist now, which some folks would say, well, that's, I'm a Christian, and there are different faiths within my church. My language of religion and my experience of it come through, the language of Christianity. That's my native tongue, I would say. But I love hearing these other experiences as well, and from people who really don't, who have, I would say, faithful paths, but not necessarily ones that include a deity. The important thing for me in this work that I do is that spirituality reminds me that I am, it keeps my ego in check. I am not in charge. Even if I don't define exactly this larger power within my life, operationally, it still works. When I say, this, I can't control this. I got to let go of it. And that's a big part of my spiritual life, I would say, and asking for help in different ways, and trying to practice that. I do believe it's something you can get better at by doing it. But my overall sense is that that for me, the theology is not as important as the practice, and it's possible to actually worship with people who are not going to say the Nicene Creed with you. That there's a diversity of opinion.
Wow. Tim, I actually did not expect that answer, and I am almost worthless. That it's such a beautiful description, and I think, wow, I love it. I had one of my close friends on an episode earlier in this series, Samantha Leonard, and she gave this sort of her description of the many paths to get to what she called either God, if you want to call it that, enlightenment, the code, if you just didn't like that kind of language. And it's exactly the same imagery that you're describing is, at this community level, being able to worship with people. You may not be able to speak their language, fluently, but you remain curious. And man, I love it. I'm so glad that we went here. I do want to honor your time, but I have at least one more question with regards to the social structure of churches and this sort of kind of community institution. I see myself. Who knows what the future holds? But I see churches as a place to practice medicine. It's where community is already being made. People are afraid sometimes of coming to the doctor. So why don't I come to them? Come to a place that they already see as healing. They see the church as healing. They don't necessarily see the doctor's office as healing. And so, I envision perhaps, and I have a friend of mine, a second-year medical student. He's in Tennessee, and we've talked at length as dreamers. What would it be like to create this network of practitioners who would work in these churches and be the church doctor, or whatever you want to call it, or be the theologic doctor, the spiritual doctor, be someone there dedicated to the body component as well as the mind, and acknowledging the spirit of these individuals, but bring about healing directly in these communities. And was curious to see from your standpoint, having discussed the importance of that social structure and meeting personal needs, have you seen this play out in any of the communities you've been a part of, or with any individuals you've networked with as part of rural strategies?
My personal experience with that is where we lived in Letcher County, Kentucky, southeast Kentucky, when I was working at Apple Shop. We went to a little country Presbyterian church, and there was a nurse midwife who delivered our two kids, or was involved in them with those deliveries, who was there in that church, and the doctor in the main office that I went to was part of that church as well. And I mean, I never went and asked for medical advice from them, but I knew them in that setting, and it enriched the clinical setting a great deal. In rural areas, there's a greater chance, if you go to a funeral, you're going to be there with your dentist and your lawyer and your school teacher. There's these crossover things from it's not just a professional relationship. So I have seen it work like that, where it's made me feel, it's comforting to be with them in that other setting of a church and to share that. I also know, of course, that, one of the largest missions of, at least Protestant churches and Catholic, medical mission is something you hear about always. And, where I grew up, there was a missionary doctor. So it's certainly something the church acknowledges, and in the Gospels, healing is if not job one, right up there. But I've never heard of churches having their own doctor. I'm sure that some of them do, but I would imagine they're so big that you might not have the same experience that you would like to have. Oddly enough, the other place I have experienced this feeling of support in the medical community has been in dealing with hospice care.
Yes. Yeah.
And somewhat with babies too. But in hospice care, there's generally a chaplain, and the doctors that I've dealt with and the nurses are very much about, there's something holy going on here. And I didn't expect that, but I would say that's probably the closest I've come to see kind of a medical situation where the spiritual part of it was kind of wrapped into the medical part closely.
Yeah. It becomes nearly inseparable. I have a very close friend who is a hospice nurse, and am also good friends with the hospice coordinators at my hospital. And talking to both of them, especially my close friend, it's interesting to see that experience play out. And she has told me on more than one occasion that she'll have patients who may have been atheists with no, self-prescribed, I have no spirituality, there's no space for something bigger, but something happens at the end of life, and she is able to hold that type of space. I have no idea what's really going on, but there's something happens in that space at the end of life, and this new sense of spirituality, something greater, something bigger comes out, whatever it is. But she's just been a part of that and described that phenomenon to me, and it's amazing to see. But they really do in hospice, I think, really address mind, body, spirit, and hold a space where, if the patient and their family want it, it can be a holy place. I think is the best way to describe it. So, man, well, Tim, this has been so wonderful. I'm so glad we connected, and I want to give you a little time here at the end. It's something I usually do with my guests, and give you this space here at the end to share whatever final thoughts, reflections, or stories you may have that you feel that this audience would benefit from hearing.
Well, it's been enjoyable for me to talk to you, Rob, and I appreciate the questions you've asked and that you're doing this podcast. And the only thing I would add is, in a text, it would be YMMV. No rural. Your mileage may vary. No rural place is. They're all different. They got things in common, but they're also unique. And so I don't profess to have a lock on that experience. Our friend at Chuck Fluharty says, when you've seen one rural place, you've seen one rural place.
Yeah.
And so if I have said something that doesn't sound like your community and you're listening to this, it's like, I acknowledge that I probably haven't. I mean, I know for a fact I haven't. So these are personal reflections in my experience, and it's really encouraging. It encourages me to be able to share them with you. So thank you for that.
You're most certainly welcome, and I appreciate you sharing them. And for people who are listening, who are curious to know more about rural strategies or the Daily Yonder or these other initiatives that you guys have been pushing forward, how can they follow you, or what's the best way to get in contact?
Well, our main outlet for information is the dailyyonder.com. So it's Daily Yonder, one word, .com. And we post at least one story a day on a rural topic. You can sign up for a weekly rehash of what the stories are, and I think a lot of people enjoy looking at it that way. The National Rural Assembly is ruralassembly.org. And, we've been out there enough that the search engines will pop up those things if you don't have the address. I enjoy hearing from people who are in rural areas or have been or have thoughts about that. So, I welcome connection, and, the information on how to reach us is in those websites.
Wonderful. Well, I'll make sure to have links to those pages and that information on our podcast page for folks. So, well, Tim, once again, it's been a pleasure. I hope you're doing well. It's been a little bit of a cold one here for the last couple of weeks. I think we're maybe getting out of it for a short bit, but I really do appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation.
Thank you.
All right, have a good day.
You too.
Thank you for your presence and willingness to receive a new narrative, a passionate perspective, and perhaps a deeper sense of connection with our collective purpose. Please share this podcast with any and all that you believe will benefit from its intention to relieve one's doing and engage one's being. Please share your comments about the conversation on our podcast page and leave a review in iTunes so that the voices in this space can spread to all ears ready to receive it. Music credit goes to Dillingham for their song Vessel. Remain open, stay curious, and forever be love.
You walked on fire, and I know you tried.